Киев возьмем, тогда закончится беспредел с беспилотниками. Пока будем продолжать отражать эти подлые террористические выходки в режиме такой повседневной деятельности. Мы имеем дело с очень подлым противником, который не воюет традиционными методами, а который привык бить из-под тишка. То есть, по сути, продолжает все эти террористические атаки. Или что такое? Поэтому мы четко должны это понимать. С террористом всегда сложнее справиться, чем с обычным военным противником. Но мы справимся.
So, gentlemen, I do think we are in the final stages of the Ukraine war.
How do you see this war ending, and what do you think the West should do? Should they stop military aid to Ukraine?
I believe that it's actually not a frozen conflict. I believe that the Russians are winning the war, and that the Russians will end up with an ugly victory.
My last video was about an article from Asia Times written by a Columbia University educated American economic strategist David Woolman, who said he was privy to a clandestine meeting of Western high-ranking officials, and what concerned him is that none of those officials were talking about peace in Ukraine, despite the fact that they know how bad the situation is in Ukraine for the Ukrainian army. They know that they have not damaged Russia in any serious way because they are working with the assumption that Ukrainian casualties far outnumber Russian casualties. But yet they are not talking about any peace deal. So this begs the question, if there is no peace, but then the West knows that NATO cannot enter into Ukraine and defeat Russia along that defense line in eastern Ukraine, then what is the plan? So recently, we know that Victoria Nulled resigned. And my first estimation of her resignation was that this must be a sign that America is getting ready to wipe its hands of this Ukraine war.
It's here, Chasiv Yar, that already looks like defeat. Those left sounding like they'd be just about okay when Russia comes.
Я хочу внучку видеть, в Москве внучка, сестра в Калининграде. Да честно, пол России, там мои родственники. Но я здесь один.
Воды нет, газа нет, света нету, ничего нет. Отъедьте от дома. Они подъезжают прямо к домам, там, где живут люди, и стреляют прямо возле дома. Они прячутся за спинами мирных жителей.
Because Victoria Nulled was the mother of the whole Ukraine debacle. Ukraine was her baby. She was there since 2014 and was involved in the Maidan revolution to overthrow the pro-Russian government.
We, of course, never choose candidates in any country. But what we do in countries that proclaim to be democracies is we offer the opportunity for candidates of all kinds to learn how to put themselves forward to best effect.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably.
We don't do that now, though. We don't mess around other people's elections.
Only for a very good cause.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going.
Her phone call with another Western official, Piat, was leaked, where she was talking about installing a new government in Ukraine. So for her to resign, to me, was a sign that they have given up on the Ukraine war. But then, shortly after her resignation, she gave a speech in which she said that we have some nasty surprises prepared for Russia.
With this money, Ukraine will be able to fight back in the east, but it will also be able to accelerate the asymmetric warfare that has been most effective on the battlefield. And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield.
A few weeks later, we saw this terrorist attack on the Crocus Concert Hall.
Some news that's just coming in this hour. Russia's investigative committee says the perpetrators of Friday's terrorist attack received significant amounts of money and cryptocurrency from Ukraine, which were used in preparing the crime.
So then I started to realize that this talk about no peace in Ukraine means possibly that the West will continue to wage war against Russia, not on the battlefield, but through these other proxy attacks. And this is where I think it can get dangerous. After that terrorist attack on the Crocus Concert Hall, Vladimir Putin gave some words of warnings. And I may misquote them as I don't have the material before me. but he said something to the equivalent that Russia is no longer at war just with the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, but the neo-Nazi regime in the West.
After the Crocus City concert hall massacre, the Russian authorities continue to promote their narrative that Ukraine and the West were somehow behind it. Line in the government paper, Rossiyskaya Gazeta today, the trail leads to Washington. The SVR, Russian Foreign Intelligence, does not exclude the involvement of the US and Kyiv. The murder of civilians in Moscow region, the Crocus attack, is directly related to the mass shelling of Kursk and Belgorod regions and attacks there by sabotage groups.
That is an escalatory statement which suggests that although Putin will achieve the goals of a special military operation on the battlefield, this is now total war with the West. And this is where, to me, things will get a bit scary. Now, it is clear as day to me that Russia is on the path to certain military victory in Ukraine through attrition war. Everyone is talking about an upcoming Russian offensive this summer that will not be a big arrow dive deep into Ukraine, but will occur across the entire front line, slowly and gradually moving forward, meter by meter, destroying NATO equipment and Ukrainian soldiers until it collapses. But, as I just indicated, now it seems that is not sufficient for Russia's insurance of Ukrainian neutrality. With Victoria Null's comments, along with this recent terrorist attack, it is becoming clear, I think, to President Putin that he must go further and eliminate the current regime in Kyiv.
Будет ли это Киев? Да, наверное, это должен быть и Киев. Если не сейчас, то через какое-то время. По двум причинам. Киев – русский город, и оттуда исходит угроза существованию Российской Федерации.
And that is where I think things can get a bit tricky. It increases the possibility of regional conflict, but it can get tricky for Russia. I am not a military man, but I've read a lot of military assessments to understand how and why the Russians fight the way they do. And my understanding is that as long as the Russian army stays within that protected bubble in eastern Ukraine behind that Surovikin defense line, they have all the advantages and will destroy any army trying to penetrate. Their supply lines are very short and close to the Russian border on Crimea. The logistical lines are now running smoothly. Their troops are battle-hardened. They know the territory in the east of Ukraine like the back of their hand, and most important of all, they are within friendly Russian-speaking territories. The Crocus Concert Hall attack, to me, was an attempt to achieve two objectives. The lesser objective, when I say lesser in likelihood, is to sow enough panic in the Russian people that they lose confidence in Putin to protect themselves and come to the streets. Well, that clearly has not and will not happen, as we just saw in the Russian elections that he won with some 87% of the vote, and over 80% of the Russian people turned out to vote. So the support and solidarity in Russia behind President Putin is massive. But the other goal, I think, was to try to provoke Putin to do a rash response. I just looked at an article from the Times in the UK, which was entitled, "We Must Prepare for the Fall of Kyiv." And all across Western media, there's several articles talking about the anxiety of this upcoming Russian offensive. You see, the problem is, for Putin, is that to launch an offensive on Kyiv would require him to send a column, perhaps from Belarus or from one of those northern oblasts in Russia, separately to Kyiv, similar to what they did the first time, although the first time they went to Kyiv was not an attempt to lay siege to the city, but just an attempt for political reasons to get a peace deal. This time, if they have to force Zelensky to surrender, they're going to need a very significant force that is going to be isolated in the North Ukraine. And all the advantages that Russia has in East Ukraine will not be as readily available in Kyiv. Most important of all, it's not going to be in Russian-friendly speaking territory. But here's the other thing that I have been thinking about. I think Ukraine and the West are taking a page out of Russia's Maskarov book. I do think Ukraine has been husbanding some of the resources and equipment away from the front line because they know that the Russians are now effective at destroying all NATO equipment on the front line, particularly after that summer counteroffensive of 2023, which was an absolute massacre and debacle for NATO. I think that they have kept definitely some of the air defense and a lot of the NATO equipment back in Kyiv. I also think they have held some of the reserve troops in Kyiv. I also think it's possible that Macron and maybe other countries have already sent small contingents of NATO forces, perhaps not under the banner of NATO, mercenaries, and they are in Kyiv. It's very possible that you could have an army of, let's say, 50,000 Ukrainian reserves and another 50,000 NATO troops in Kyiv, along with some NATO equipment, enough perhaps to equip some of the civilians in Kyiv, and turn Kyiv into a massive fortress. Kyiv is a city of perhaps 3 million people. To take a city of that size, if it's fortified, and if there are 100 to 200,000 men in arms waiting, Russia is going to need an army of perhaps 600,000-700,000 men. And that army will be far away from the supply lines and the defenses in East Ukraine. And when I see some of these articles coming about suggesting the fall of Kyiv, it's almost apparent to me that the West may be trying to bait Russia and provoke Russia through these pinprick terrorist attacks to go for Kyiv, where a trap may be waiting for him. This is all speculation, but it is possible to me because everyone knows that the battle in East Ukraine is lost for the Ukrainians. This may be the last stand, and I think President Putin has to be careful, or has to have a clever plan of how he's going to end this war if there is indeed, as my previous video said, no chance of peace with the West.
I believe the Russians now control about 20% of Ukrainian territory. The balance of power has shifted decisively in Russia's favor in terms of both weaponry and manpower, which are of great importance in a war of attrition like the one you see taking place in Ukraine. And what I think is going to happen is that the Russians will end up conquering about 40% of Ukrainian territory.